So we've gotten finally to the end of Daniel, to the last 3 chapters, which contain some of, I think, the most important and also, in some cases, most mysterious, or at least confusing material in the book. I wanted to begin by reading the first verse of chapter 10, because we've talked about how we're in this genre of apocalypse and the relationship between the genre and the book of Revelation. And it's just, I can't help but read this verse in that light. The verse, chapter 10 begins, "In the 3rd year of King Cyrus of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel. The word was true, and it concerned a great conflict. He understood the word, having received understanding in the vision." It resonates with that, there is a kind of sort of secret knowledge. There is, it reads like Revelation to me, and I'm not even a New Testament scholar.
Yeah, the oddity of it, though, is that in this case, he doesn't describe the vision.
Yeah.
He just tells you, I got the vision.
And he goes into some detail about saying how he got the vision, right? This is not just, I was sitting there and it came to me. He prepares for it. It's like a spiritual preparation.
That's what is interesting, too. In this case, he fasts and doesn't anoint himself, which probably means he didn't wash for a couple of weeks.
Yep.
That's one way of doing it.
That's one way of seeing things, for sure.
Now, in some of the other apocalypses, there are, I think, more attractive ways. In one called Forth Ezra, Ezra is told to go out into the field and eat the flower that is in the field. And after it, he has a great vision. And then at the end of the book, he's told to drink a fiery liquid. And after that, he just spouts out the whole Torah and can hardly stop talking. These are other ways of triggering it. You wonder, though, did the people who wrote these books use some of these techniques? It's not out of the question.
They certainly seem to have known about them, which is usually a good sign. The vision that he sees here is, again, is a battle. Right? This is war. At least it seems to be war. Again, we don't actually get the vision itself, but we have descriptions of heavenly beings in battle.
The interesting point about it is that it's not just a battle on earth.
Right.
That what he's told, first of all, is that the angel Gabriel comes to him and says, well, I'm just taking a time out here. Actually, I'm fighting with the Prince of Persia. Yeah. And when he's finished, the Prince of Greece will come. And they have nobody helping me except Michael, your prince. Now, especially from the case of Michael, you can tell what a prince means here. Yeah. A prince is what we'd call a patron angel, the figure who presides over the nation on a heavenly level. And so what he's saying is, you think these are wars between people on earth? These are only reflections. The real war is being fought upstairs in heaven between the angelic forces that preside over these nations.
He also goes on to give a remarkably detailed sort of overview of history. Yeah. Really just a quite thorough, there's kings and battles and defeats and the whole thing. What, if any of that is of interest to, say, Daniel or to us?
It's of interest to us that he seems to have had a good historical source.
Yeah.
Now, they didn't seem to know much of anything about the Persian period, but they had very good records of the Hellenistic period, and especially of the wars between Syria and Egypt. But it really only becomes of interest to us when you get to Antiochus Epiphanes, our friend, who arises, he's introduced as a contemptible person to whom the kingdom had not been given. He's presented as a usurper. And he comes in somewhere around chapter 11, verses 20 or 21, thereabouts. Yep. And then it becomes quite intense from there on.
Yeah. And he is, in this scene, this is, I think, I may be wrong, this is the only place in the Old Testament where Rome is even alluded to. Is that fair?
Right. And what it's called is, they refer to ships of the Kittim. Now, the historical incident in question was a famous one. Antiochus had invaded Egypt, and he invaded it twice. First time, he pretty well overran the country. He was the uncle of the Ptolemy, and he set things up so that things would go his way. But then he came back a couple of years later, and it didn't go so well. And this time he was confronted on the beach outside Alexandria by a Roman legate named Popilius Laenas, who demanded that he withdraw from Egypt and drew a circle around him in the sand and said he wanted his answer before he stepped out of that circle. Antiochus was no fool. He withdrew from Egypt. But this was known as the Day of Eleusis. Eleusis was the place where it happened. But the ships of the Kittim, Daniel says that he will be confronted by ships of the Kittim. Kittim comes from Kitium in Cyprus. It could refer to any people who came from the west. In 1 Maccabees, Alexander the Great is the king of the Kittim. But here it's the Romans. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, generally speaking, it's the Romans.
Again, giving us a fairly solid historical background for the authorship.
Very much so.
We really have to concentrate, I think, on the end here of this vision, because this is the Old Testament's great moment of resurrection. Can you describe is it resurrection the way that we typically think of it?
Well, let's take a little run up to it first of all, because though it's all very enigmatic, as it's stated in Daniel, and they're not naming names or anything, but it says how then the king would install an abomination that makes desolate in the temple, which probably was a pagan altar, and then that some of the people who resisted his demands would be killed and made white. It says, and then others would help them deceptively. They'd receive a little help. And that's often been taken as a slighting reference to the Maccabees. I'm not sure whether that's right. I'm not sure he would have regarded the Maccabees as a help at all. Because then it goes on to say how the king will eventually come to his end. And then Michael will arise. This is the archangel. In other words, the heavenly battle will come to its conclusion and Michael will arise in victory. And then he says, at that time many will arise. Some to everlasting glory and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, he doesn't say everybody will arise. The very good and the very bad. If you are boring in this life, sleep on. Now, but then also he doesn't say they'll come back on earth. That the wise, who have been the heroes in the time of the persecution, he said, will shine like the brightness of the firmament. This is the Zohar. And it means like they'll shine like they'll become companions to the stars.
Right.
And we get this in other apocalypses in the book of Enoch. It means that they will become companions to the angelic host. They will be up there with the angels. Now, I don't think Daniel means that the world will come to an end, because you also had predictions of a kingdom on earth, and presumably that too would happen. But for these people, especially the ones who lost their life in the persecution, this is the hope, that they'll be transformed into angelic beings.
Is this eschatological in the sense that what we've seen as the division between the angelic realm and the earthly realm is in a sense collapsed?
Yes, I think that's right. And you'll get that also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they thought they were already living with the angels.
Yeah.
At least Daniel said, well, after you die.
But, it's when Michael arises, right? That is sort of like on this earth, right? That's...
Well, he arises in victory. Think of him wrestling with the Prince of Greece. And then he gets up, and the other guy doesn't.
But it's mirrored.
It's mirrored, yes.
It's mirrored.
Yes. I think anything that happens in heaven in this book also happens on earth.
Right. So, though this is certainly the fullest sort of vision of a resurrection in the Old Testament, is it the first in the sense of, no, I never thought of this before?
Well, I think, in the Old Testament proper, You have a couple of passages that speak metaphorically. The most famous one is Ezekiel's vision of the valley full of dry bones. But then he says at the end of it, what I'm really talking about is the restoration of Israel.
Yeah.
And then there's a very disputed one in the book of Isaiah, chapter 26, which says, thy dead shall live. And now whether that's like Ezekiel or meaning a real resurrection is very much disputed.
Sure.
I think it's more like Ezekiel myself. But I don't think Daniel invented the idea of resurrection, because you get it also in parts of the book of Enoch that were earlier, probably a little bit earlier. But it's really, I think, sometime there in the beginning of the 2nd century that you have people beginning to take this language of resurrection, which you get already in prophecy, but then they begin to take it literally. And you see, if you really do believe in resurrection, it changes the whole ballgame. You know, it means that your future isn't your children and your children's children. If your goal is to live forever with the angels in heaven, that could lead to a very different lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean, does that image here in Daniel, does it allow for a far more strident confrontation with the antagonistic powers, as opposed to what we see, for example, in the first half of the book, where it's very much we can successfully live together because we don't see an end to being part of this sort of intermingled community. Here, when they start to imagine, we can be resurrected, then
I think it's the possibility of living with the Syrian rule breaks down first, and the hope of resurrection and definitive separation is the answer to that. But you've already had the conflict. But now, if you believe in a resurrection, you have nothing to lose in a way. So you get killed, fast ticket to heaven. There are still people in the world who think this way.
Yeah, I was certainly thinking very much the same thing. Is this a dangerous idea to a certain extent?
To a certain extent, it is, because if you're not afraid to lose your life, then you can do anything.
Yeah. The last bit of the book that is needs explanation, truly explanation, is. Again, I'm afraid a math problem. Is that at the end of the book, it seems as if we have been talking about sort of abstract, grand future time, until somebody came along and said, "I'm going to give you some exact years, right? Some exact calculations as to." But the math doesn't quite. Is that right? It doesn't quite work out.
Well, they actually get down to counting days. They've been saying 3.5 years. Okay, there's a little fudge time in that. But now, if you're getting towards the end of the 3.5 years, and you get, if you have in front of you, the actual number of days predicted there at the very end of the book. And
yes, the 1,335 days.
And then in the next verse?
This 1,290 days.
Is the first one.
Is the first one.
And then, blessed are those who last 1,335 days.
Right. Now, those extra 45 days are going to make all the difference.
They are. But now, okay, what's going on there?
Yeah.
This happened also with the Millerites. That when things didn't happen the first time, the first reaction is to say, we made a mistake in the math.
Yeah.
Let's do run the numbers again and reset.
Yeah.
Maybe the Lord has given us an extension. And I think that's surely what's happening here, is that the first number passed. And now, one of the great things about the Bible is when they change it, they typically don't clean up.
Right.
They tend to add and not delete. And therefore you can see what they're doing.
So your suggestion, and I think there's really no question, is that these last verses of the book of Daniel are later still sort of tacked on.
Yes. Now, mind you, not a lot
Not much
later,
later.
but just a little bit later.
Yeah.
But what is interesting, if you believe the books of Maccabees, according to First Maccabees, the temple was actually purified 3 years to the day after it was desecrated. Both of these numbers take you beyond that. Mm-hmm. And my guess is that whoever wrote the book of Daniel didn't accept the Maccabean purification of the temple. Mm. They were looking for something a little bit more spectacular, including the resurrection of the dead.
Yeah.
And presumably you'd notice if that happened.
A reminder again, and we happen so often, that we tend to think of ancient Judaism, Christianity as all basically fundamentally agreeing with each other. But in fact, we had sectarianism and different ideas about all of this from the get-go. Yeah. Perhaps as we finish up, final thoughts about the book of Daniel and that really this wide range from stories like Joseph and Esther to something very much like the book of Revelation. In a sense, the book of Daniel takes us through a period of Israelite history in a very particular way. I mean, it's through visions and interpretations, but you really get a sense as you read of the shifting sort of values of ancient Judaism, at least in a particular time and place, how it was that they encountered the outside world. Daniel, more than many other books, gives us a window into how they saw themselves as part of the world.
The great theme, I think, that runs through the whole book is the kingdom of this world is passing away. Mm-hmm. Regardless of what that kingdom is. Now, of course, it has the hope for a kingdom that will never pass away. Mm-hmm. But that always remains in the future. But any kingdom that we actually encounter, and this, I think, is still relevant, no matter who has the hegemonic power at any given time, it's not going to last all that long.
Right.
That, I think, is what gives the book a lot of its power.